to our community moving forward. And I think we're going to turn um, the stage over, the Zoom stage over to you, Chris, now, and we can get your slides up. So welcome to NPSO. Thank you for joining us. We're so glad to have you. And like I mentioned, that we're really excited to have a couple of speakers that align really well with our current conservation world. So thanks for joining us.
Well, hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here to talk to you at the Native Plant Society. I am actually a botanist myself. I got really fascinated with this funny thing about plants, which is that they burn. And that's kind of what got me into fire, right? So, but you know, I feel very comfortable and at home talking to a group of plant people. So it's really a pleasure. Um, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So, yeah, a couple of things following up on what Vanessa said. Yeah, I know Ariel, and I'm really happy that you'll be talking with Ariel next time. We both worked on projects involving the Karuk tribe in Northern California at about the same time. So that's really fun that we now end up working together on projects, including working with tribes on fire-related issues in the Rogue Basin. And I do also apologize if anybody was there for the talk with the Rogue Native Plant Partnership, that you will be seeing a lot of the same material today. So I wanted to talk about fire behavior and native plants and plants in general, and specifically in relation to the Almeda Drive fire. And I'm not an expert on this. I'll start with that. Um, uh, I don't think that really anybody is an expert on these types of urban fires. Actually, these types of urban fires are really a new problem that started really in a big way with the town of Paradise and Santa Rosa a few years ago, and this is basically the first time we're seeing something like this in Oregon. So we're really all kind of needing to find new solutions here, and that's what we'll be talking about: is how do we find new solutions involving plants, our plant friends. So a little bit about my background. I started this position in October. The extension, OSU's extension fire program is brand new, just started last year. And we are, I'll talk a little bit actually about it in the next slide. For myself, I came from UC Davis. I did my doctorate there and just completed that last year in ecology. My interests are fire ecology, in particular, looking at how wildfires affect ecosystems, different intensities and severities of fire, and also how our management through thinning and burning or letting fires overlap naturally, how that can affect the outcomes for biodiversity. I'm really interested in community-based fire management and people sitting down and making a plan for how we're going to take care of our communities and our wildlands, including through the use of prescribed fire. And another thing that I did hint at was in my work, I worked with tribes throughout California who are doing really interesting work revitalizing the use of cultural burning, the traditional use of fire to manage plant communities in California. So that was the main focus actually of my research, and something that has been very influential to me is to think about this relationship that people have had with fire going back, well, since time immemorial. And I'd be happy to talk about that at another talk. So the OSU Extension Fire Program I mentioned, we just started, and our goal is to help bring about more collaborative landscape management projects, particularly forest restoration and prescribed fire in a way that will make our communities safer and our wildlands more healthy and vibrant. We do this using the tools of extension, which are education and outreach, webinars, trainings, field days. We support partnerships for landscape planning, and we support communities who are seeking to make these changes to become more fire adapted. And we do this through applied research. How do we get changes on the ground to how we are managing the land with fire? So before I go any further, the Almeda Drive fire is what I want to talk about, because like I said, it's such a new type of fire, and we really need to come together and put our minds together and think about what happened and what we can do about it. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of people have been impacted by this fire in really devastating ways. We still have, I believe, close to 1,000 people who are unsheltered as a result of this fire. So really a dramatic impact on really vulnerable communities in the area. And, I'm going to talk about this in my presentation, maybe kind of sensey way. And I don't mean to seem detached at all, because I wanna honor and respect the impact that this fire has had on people, right? So, but we're gonna have to think about this and talk about this, and I hope that that doesn't come across as in any way minimizing the impact of this fire on people. So first, I want to just look at some images, and these are from a helicopter flyover. You can find it on YouTube if you want to watch the whole thing. And you can see this is near the beginning of where the fire started. It's close to the sewage plant on Almeda Drive. And right away, right here at the beginning, you can see a lot of different types of habitats were burning. It was burning through open grassland, through riparian forest, through savanna. And as it progressed, it found more different kinds of things to burn. Here it was burning right through a pear orchard. You can see this retardant drop here in orange, red, that didn't seem to really stop this fire at this point. And as it kept going north, at this point, this is just north of the Ray's Food Place in Phoenix, and it was just at this point a fully urban fire burning from one structure to the next. So the question I wanted to talk about with you, since this is the Native Plant Society, I want to talk about plants, and I want to talk about how plants affect fire behavior, and particularly in urban environments. And so I started thinking about this because originally I was asked to talk about the flammability of plants, and how some plants are more flammable and other plants are less flammable, and how we could use that to make our communities safer. And I was thinking about that, and I thought that was really interesting. And then I started to think about the assumptions behind that, right? I started to think that how we think about plants. How do we think about plants and their role in carrying fire? And I came to the conclusion, I think, and this is, you tell me what you think, because I'm just putting this out there as something that I hope will spur conversations. But I think that most of the time when we talk about plants and fire, we are talking about plants as a risk. We are talking about plants as a danger, because plants burn and we don't want our homes to burn. So therefore plants are dangerous, and we need to minimize the risk of danger by reducing the amount of plants in our environment, or choosing plants that burn less easily. And so this is a mental model that I will call the green danger model, right? Plants are a green danger, they burn. And so we need to address the danger that plants represent. And I think this is pretty intuitive because this is what we talk about. This is what's operating in the back of our minds when we talk about forest thinning and fuels reduction and prescribed burning a lot of the time, right? We're saying we need to remove vegetation to make these areas less flammable. It's what we're talking about when we talk about defensible space. So around our homes, we need to thin vegetation. We need to make sure there isn't anything flammable within 5 feet of our buildings. So we're operating under this mental model of green danger, right? So this is not criticism because we know that these things work. We know that forest thinning is important and in some ecosystems, and prescribed fire is healthy, and we know that defensible space works. So that's great, but it's only, I think, one side of the coin. And the other one is we could look at plants as a green solution. What I mean is, how can we see plants not just as a danger, but as something that could make our communities safer? So we'll talk about this more, and I'll go into some examples of what I mean. But first, I do need to start with a caveat, which is that even though I want to talk about plants, because look, I'm not an engineer, and so I can't really talk about buildings. And plus, this is the Native Plant Society, so I'm going to stick to talking about plants. But what we do need to acknowledge is that a lot of this fire was buildings burning buildings, and really plants had very little to do with the equation. This is the north end of the fire in Phoenix. And you can see from the aerial image on the right that the fire at this point had left the greenway and it was burning entirely through neighborhoods, and it was just burning from one structure to the next in a chain reaction. The only structures that survived actually are the ones that you see on the top in the middle, which were actually the ones tucked against the greenway. On the bottom left, you can see that these trees are charred. All these trees are burnt, right? But the trees are burnt because they burnt as a result of the homes near them burning, right? So in this fire, most of what we saw was homes burning trees, and not the other way around, which is what we imagine should happen. I mean, not should, hopefully it doesn't, but we tend to imagine wildland vegetation posing a risk, like I said, green danger, and our homes. In this case, really, the homes were the ones burning down the trees and other homes. And really, the thing is, our homes burn without any assistance from wildland vegetation. And we burn our homes that we built now burn 10 times faster and 8 times hotter than they did 30 years ago. So this is an important thing to keep in the back of our minds, even as, you know, I'll plow forward talking about plants, but there are certainly some considerations there around engineering and code that we're not going to address that that are important. So we want to talk about how we can plan our plantings, our landscapes, and our natural areas in a way that we can minimize structure loss in the case of these really incredible fires that are happening under extreme weather conditions. So the first thing we need to understand is how structures are lost. And there are 3 ways that structures are lost. The first is direct flame contact. And so this is what people imagine most of the time. When there's a wildfire, the wall of flames just approaches and then it engulfs the structure and basically keeps moving. In reality, this is rarely what causes our structures and our homes to burn down. The number one culprit is embers. So when you have a fire burning and the wind is blowing, it's howling, right? We had 70-mile-an-hour wind. a lot of embers are being produced, and they go downwind and they land all over structures. It's just like a blizzard, but you replace snow with little burning particles. And so they'll fall on patio furniture, they'll fall on dry grass onto wood decks, they'll fall on leaves that weren't emptied out of the gutter. They'll find something. If there's something there, they'll go in through attic vents, and then they'll burn that house out from the inside out. Another little known fact, buildings typically burn from the inside out. So these embers get in somewhere, and then that house burns from the inside out. And the last cause of structure loss is radiant heat. So if there's a lot of heat coming off of a bunch of vegetation burning or another home nearby burning, the heat could be enough to ignite the siding of a house. Or more often, what will happen is that the windows will break, especially if you have single paned windows, they'll break, and then embers will get in, and again, that house burns from the inside out. So these are the three ways that homes are lost. So we'll think about how we can address these. And the first thing that would be really helpful, I think, to consider in our planting, in our landscapes, in our natural areas around our communities is the work of firefighters. So firefighters need to be able to do their work, and they need to be able to do it safely. So they need to have visibility. They need to be able to see, right? They need to be able to have access in and out. And they would rather not work under conditions where the fire is moving fast or with long flame lengths, right? Because that's going to be dangerous, and they're not going to put themselves in a dangerous position. So in the case of the Almeda Drive fire, in the case of plants in this urban area, I have a photo here of blackberries burning. And so you can see these blackberries, right? We're going to talk a bit about blackberries. I know some of you figured this was coming, but we're going to talk about blackberries for sure. These blackberries, when they burn, they put off really long flame lengths because they have a lot of dried material down inside, because year after year canes die and accumulate, and it creates a lot of flammable material. So really long flame lengths, really a lot of embers. And this is a really small patch in this photo. It's not in the area here. But you can imagine if you had a house that was surrounded by blackberries, or if you had a natural area like the Greenway, which has a lot of blackberries, firefighters just cannot put themselves in the way of those flames. They can't get in there, they can't work safely, and they can't operate. So we need to think about that. The next thing I mentioned, the number one reason of structure loss is ember production. So we need to find ways to deal with this, and it's very complicated. There's not much we can do to stop embers from being produced. The physics are pretty complicated, right? It's just a lot of embers, millions of little embers, and they'll blow downwind and start new fires downwind from the main fire, and then spread the fire that way. And a home can have really good defensible space, unfortunately, like the one in this photo, that has a nice lawn, short grass, and a non-flammable vegetation, rock mulch. It just looks great. And unfortunately, an ember must have come across the road and found some vulnerable spot on the structure, and that structure was lost. So unfortunately, like I said, there's just not much we can do to stop embers being produced. It would be nice if we could find out that, hey, these make embers, but that's not going to happen. Embers are going to be produced, and in this urban environment, once one structure burns, it's going to produce millions of embers that are going to go right onto the next building, and that one's going to burn, produce millions of embers, and so on and so forth. So it's a tricky situation to prevent. And the last thing I talked about is radiant heat. It would be nice if we could minimize structure loss from radiant heat. Again, in the Almeda Drive fire, the radiant heat that led to structures burning was really from other structures. So vegetation causing a lot of heat and burning structures was not really an issue here. But if we look within the greenway, there were areas that had a lot of blackberries, 15 feet tall blackberries on this photo on the bottom right, on the bottom left, and these mature cottonwoods. And then you can see the heat was so intense that it just exploded the bark off of those trees. So a huge amount of heat that was being produced here. And these trees will resprout because the majority of broadleaf species resprout, but so are the blackberries going to resprout. And so at this point in 15 years, the blackberries will probably be as tall as the cottonwood resprouts. Well, I guess cottonwoods grow pretty fast, so maybe in 5 years. And the blackberries will be at that point flammable again, ready to burn. And I'm afraid we might at this point, without any intervention, start getting into a cycle where we don't have those trees anymore in the canopy to shade out the blackberries. So the blackberries are just going to come back even stronger. In contrast, the top right photo, you can see this is a restoration site at Wagner Creek by the Freshwater Trust. And in this photo, you can see the heat was much less. This sign is blistered a little bit, but it survived. The sign survived, right? And in this area, they'd taken out all the blackberries and replanted native plants. You can see there's a lot of leaves on the trees that remain, and the leaves didn't even burn up completely. So the intensity of the fire, the amount of heat produced here in this area that had been restored with native vegetation was just much less. These are some more pictures of this area. And you can see that the trees here will survive. There wasn't enough heat to kill these trees. So next year, this spring, they'll probably leaf out and we'll still have a canopy of trees, providing all the benefits that does to a riparian ecosystem, as well as inhibiting the growth of blackberries and reducing the intensity of future fires. So this is an ecosystem that not only is less of a risk to surrounding areas, but is also more resilient. So it's not like the blackberry infested area going to become more flammable as a result of this fire. If anything, this forest is probably healthier now. You can even see that the leaves that were scorched fell on the ground and provided a nice little mulch layer. So I think that's one success story out of all of this disaster. So I've talked about the issues, about why structures burn down, and now what can we do about it? Well, I'm going to start with, we're going to go back to these two mental models, right? Green danger, green solution. And I want to dive into that a little bit more. And again, this is something I'm throwing out just to get some gears turning and just to think about this with you. And we're in an unprecedented situation here. We don't know what the future is made of. Is this going to happen again? I can't say it's not, right? So we need to think, and we need to find new ways of thinking about this problem and be creative. So if we use the older or established mental model of green danger, the first thing to do that would be logical is to vegetation, right? So we can create fuel breaks, for example. Could we create fuel breaks perpendicular to the direction of the valley of the which is the direction that the wind is going to go, and stop the fire that way? in the future. Well, that's not going to work because we talked about these embers, right? And these embers are just going to fly right over a fuel break like that. In some situations, fuel breaks work, but under these extreme weather conditions, probably not. So I showed some photos of that restoration site. It appears that removing blackberries and replanting native shrubs and trees does have benefits. So that's great. That ecosystem that I showed you at the Wagner Creek restoration site, I think seems to indicate that we could have a lot healthier ecosystems even after a fire if we take these steps. And this one is it's a bit of a gray area, right? I'm saying let's remove blackberries because they burn. So I'm talking about a green danger kind of model here. And then I'm saying, but if we plant native shrubs and trees, they are fire resistant up to a degree. They provide shade. They don't build up fuel. And so they actually protect our communities. So we could talk about this both ways. The way on the one hand, reducing fuel, reducing risk. And on the other hand, I feel like we could talk about this in a more positive way, like these shrubs and trees are affording us a protection and safety by by virtue of their growth form and resistance to fire. So part of it is just how we talk about it. Now, another thing that struck me and really as part of what got this whole conversation going in my mind was I came across this idea of what if we planted rows of trees that will catch embers, and those embers will fall to the ground where we've done work to clear the ground, and they'll basically put themselves out. And this was an interesting idea to me because all of a sudden we're not just talking about plants the way that they could be a threat to us, but we're talking about plants in kind of creative way, like, hey, these plants could afford us protection. They could be our allies, right? And we essentially taken them out of being on team fire, and we're saying, hey, these plants, they could be assets to us, not just a liability, not just a danger. So the photo on the bottom here, bottom right, that's kind of bluish, it's an old photo. It's from Australia. And you can see that the fire came from the top left and blew down towards the bottom right. And this is a rangeland area where people had planted these shelter belts. I think the shelter belts originally were meant to provide a windbreaks from the cattle, for the cattle to hide in and rest in. But when this fire happened, it also showed the ability for these shelter belts to stop the fire, and the fire instead sort of spread around kind of like water, and then came together some distance behind those shelter belts. So this is a practice that's pretty well established actually in Australia today. And they have a lot of resources on how to build a shelter belt that will protect them from wind and fire. And it's pretty interesting. What caught my attention looking at the flyover of the Almeda Drive fire was this house on the top right. And at first when I saw this, I thought, wow, what a miracle that house didn't burn down, because look, they wouldn't get a medal for defensible space. I mean, they have a lot of shrubs and trees right around their home. A lot of those trees look like conifers, which we know are quite flammable. And I thought, wow, it's real just luck that they didn't lose their house. And then I started thinking about that. And I started thinking, what if this house survived not despite those trees, but because of those trees? And I've talked to other people who've made similar observations about houses that were behind trees, rows of trees that survived. So that's anecdotal. It's not very scientific, right? But like I said, we're in a new situation here. We need something to work on, right? And this seems to be a clue. It looks to me like the fire came in this photo, the aerial view of the Almeda Drive fire photo there. The fire came from the bottom right there and kind of went to the top left. And I'm thinking that it's possible that those trees just, all the embers flew onto those trees and hit those trees and fell to the ground. These people mowed apparently, or kept the ground pretty clear. So when those embers fell to the ground, they didn't do anything. And that's maybe what sheltered this house from otherwise millions of burning embers. Another thing that I would say as a support for this idea, which really I'm just suggesting, I'm not saying we should do this, I'm just throwing out this idea as a kind of example of what if we thought about plants as being on our side, right? So it's a bit of an example, but the NRCS funds windbreaks and shelter belts in the plains because when the wind is blowing in winter and there's a lot of snow, the shelter belts will catch the snow, and that snow will then drift up against the trees instead of drifting up against the house. So remember what I said, that a wildfire is kind of like a blizzard, but with tiny pieces of burning material instead of snow. So this makes me wonder if, again, this wouldn't be an effective way of stopping those embers the way we stop snowflakes in places that get a lot of snow and wind. Whoopsies, that was too far. And so the last thing that I thought in my last slide, I wanted to show a couple of healthy ecosystems. And the one on the right is right across on the east side of I-5 there. And it's this oak savanna area. And the fire got over I-5 and burnt through this oak savanna. But then it was controlled with this retardant drop from an airplane. And there's research from California that shows that in savannas, in oak savannas, wind is reduced, wind speed reduced. And again, these trees have the capacity to catch embers and maybe minimize the amount of embers that are blowing through. So compared to a grassland or an area where these trees would have been removed, I'm suggesting that it's possible these areas could help protect our communities. So it'd be nice to talk about these ecosystems like these oak savannas as assets to our communities and really put them forth as a positive attribute of our urban planning and our natural infrastructure. On the left, this is above Ashland, part of the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project. And so this is an area that had a prescribed burn done. And again, this forest is quite open now and has an incredible diversity of native plants and wildflowers. Well, not at this time of year, but in addition, if a fire comes through here, it will be a great place for firefighters to go and try to stop it, hopefully succeed in stopping it, because there's a lot less there for them to get in their way, honestly. And so, again, this type of ecosystem, if we restore it and we take care of it properly, could be an asset to our communities and make our communities safer. And that's really the thought that I had that I wanted to talk about, and maybe we can have a discussion after this, but I hear a lot of talk about how our forests are maybe a risk because they burn. And I'm worried about people becoming more and more afraid of the wildlands in which they live and becoming estranged from these wildlands. And I've heard about places where, You know, people moved into the country and they bought this home, and then, oh my gosh, they realized there were oak trees all around this home. So they cut all the oak trees down because they thought these oak trees were going to burn down their houses. And in reality, those oak trees probably could have added to the safety of their home in the event of a fire. It's very unlikely that an oak tree would cause somebody's house to burn down. If anything, the house would burn the oak tree down. But I just wanted to put this out there. I think in terms of messaging, I would like to try and talk more about these natural areas as something that is positive, something that in the case of a fire, it will be on our side, it will make our community safer, and try to get people to value these natural areas in that way, rather than just talking about plants as a danger. So that was my talk, and this is my contact information. If you are interested in getting in touch with me, please go ahead. You know, I'm here to help. I'm here to serve the Rogue Valley region and the southwest of Oregon. So please feel free to bring me your fire-related issues, and we'll see what we can do. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
You could, I mean, you could also leave your contact up. It's always nice
yeah.
to see people's faces, but
I'll,
I wonder if people are scrambling to get your email and be like, oh,
I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat, okay?
Perfect. Love that. Thank you so much for such a great talk. I think this is some really poignant content for the Rogue Basin right now. So I guess just to summarize some of the stuff I was watching going on in the chat, Rachel posted a neat link sort of corroborating how conventional home materials burn really fast, 8 to 10 times faster than other test materials. So there's a link in there for folks if you wanted to get that out of the chat. It's a little bit of the ways up. And I'm just going to read some comments. I think people were listing questions and comments. This first one actually is a question. So Rich Fairbanks asks, it seems like this fire calls out for a new look at zoning and building codes. What are the prospects for revising codes? And there's a couple comments under that. I think there are some people here who are sort of in the know about what's going on in our region. But if you want to speak to that, Chris, that would be awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that the way that we build is certainly has a lot to do with this. And the fact that we think fire doesn't happen or it shouldn't happen, you know, and then we're surprised when it does. And that's really a fundamental problem. We need to be prepared for fire because it's always been here. And building homes that are flammable and then hoping it doesn't burn, it's just not going to work out. We don't do that with earthquakes, you know, we don't do that with other things, right? We prepare for that. We prepare. People who live in hurricane areas, you know, hurricane prone areas, they prepare for that. And yet with fire, we go, oh, hopefully it won't happen. And if it does, the firefighters will take care of it. So that's really a problem. What are the prospects of revising codes? I can't speak to that. I can't speak to that. I think that it's in the hands of the county. I think that they're in a difficult situation because of tax revenue and not wanting to jeopardize that. But then again, in the long run, if homes burn down, tax revenue will be lost. So it's, I think, a conversation to keep having with the county. And we'll see. I'll get back to you on that if I hear changes afoot.
Great response. I think some people in the chat farther down sort of responded that people right now feel a lot of pressure to rebuild quickly and to get things permitted and out the door, given the need, the housing need that has resulted from this fire. So I think that's really in alignment with what you're saying. Susan Harris writes to everyone, I'm curious about the fire of well-irrigated plants like pear orchard versus non-irrigated ones. That would shed some light on the role of very dry weather in spurring this fire.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, we have a lot of abandoned pear orchards and or unmanaged pear orchards, I think. And we could imagine that pear orchards that have a lot of grass in them will burn more readily. Then again, in California this year, we saw irrigated vineyards burning because honestly, when the heat, when the humidity in the air is so low, it just sucks water right out of the leaves. And then if you have this fire that's advancing and pushing hot air onto these uh, vineyards or orchards, uh, they even that is no guarantee that it won't burn. So um, it's all about, we're talking here about a fire that's burned under extreme weather conditions, and that's the conditions we need to be talking about. We don't need to talk about fires under mild conditions, because if the conditions had been mild, we wouldn't have seen the situation that we saw. If there'd have been a mild weather, we wouldn't have had all these fires elsewhere in Oregon as well, which drew away firefighters and meant that we couldn't get reinforcements to the Almeda Drive fire. So yeah, under extreme weather, unfortunately, so much goes out the window, and even irrigation might not cut it.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the imagery that you were working through, and you could really see that visibly. And I think driving down I-5, that's quite apparent. Christy Mergenthaler just commented that at least for now, partners are funding invasive blackberry control in the Alameda footprint along much of the burned area. I do hear this as a sort of a call for a response in our area, and we do need to keep a watch and encourage to control far into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kate Jackson comments that questions about building materials are already being presented by several groups, and the local building staff are in a position to take this subject on. They're under heavy workload to issue building permits. And I'm seeing a bunch of questions pop up, and so I'm just going to keep trying to work through these. I think that's just a great comment. Okay, the partners in maintenance along. Oh, okay, that one's already in there. Sorry, my computer was skipping around. Phil Lanny commented that the Talent Garden Club is sending a letter to the Greenway in the City of Talent to buy native plants and plant along the Greenway. And as sort of putting out, perhaps other partners might want to support this idea to convert the Greenway, which I think community-wide is a question we're all pursuing right now. And Christy has another great comment, sort of to your point about oaks, that oak woodlands give so much, and extensive wildlife, resources, beauty, and fire resilience. Yeah, Christy, that's just great. It's true. And Christina Lefevre asks, I agree with your concerns, Chris, about people being afraid of plants and trees. I think somehow we have to help people be okay with that fire can actually be a prevention for THID kind of fire. How do we do that? Oh, this kind of fire for this kind of fire, to help people be more confident, I guess, and comfortable with the types of fire, and that are perhaps helpful in our communities. Do you have any thoughts about sort of familiarizing people with fire ecology? And I guess talks like this, of course, really help.
Yeah. Well, look, we are up against a need for culture change, really. We have to change our culture around fire, and we have to reevaluate our entire relationship with fire. And in this case, in the Almeda Drive fire footprint, I don't know what we could have done, and how it's not like a forest where a wildfire or prescribed fire will provide benefits for years to come in terms of reduced risk. In the Almeda Drive fire, we were looking at really urban areas burning with small natural areas in between, riparian forest and grassland and oak savanna in particular. So I don't think we could have necessarily made a difference through prescribed burning, or that, that those same things that apply in forests are not going to apply here. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction to make, that there are different kinds of fires that we're
yeah,
talking about.
absolutely. Every fire is different, and that's really important. I think that you're the NPSO, and one of the things you fight against is the green wall, right? Everybody sees plants and they just see a green wall. It's just like all the same, it's all green. Uh, Fire's the same way, right? I mean, every fire is different. It burns different things. It burns in different ways. It burns in different topographies. There's a different fire history where it's burning, and every fire is different. And a lot of people don't, I think, see that. They just think, oh, it's a forest fire. Never mind that it's not burning in a forest half the time. But so it's the same thing about learning about fire and fire ecology will give you that kind of insight into how every fire is different and behaves differently.
And that kind of makes me think about the differentiation between talking about fire response and emergency planning, to our building structures, where these, I'm reading Derek Severson's comment about there is an Oregon residential building code that has a section for fire resistant materials. He believes it's R327.4. And the differentiating that type of response to the building materials and the type of like wind breaks, fire breaks, and like more landscape broad planning that you're talking about, which I think is a really interesting addition to the conversation. Gretchen Voss's question, I'm not totally sure um, what, if I'm reading the question right. It says, NY research on young forest plantations act to create high ember production. Is this akin to
Mm,
blackberries?
yeah. Um, I don't know about ember production, but we do know that young forest plantations, because they are short, the wind howls right over them a lot faster. And then when it hits a mature stand, it slows down because obviously you have big trees in the way. So that's one big thing, that the wind can really pick up over the top of these young plantations. And once they're burning, and they're all the same, all the trees are the same size and they're all touching, so it's just the most flammable ecosystem out there in our forests, honestly. So I don't know about embers specifically. We do know that I have seen some research that Douglas firs produce more embers than ponderosa pines. So if you have a grudge against Douglas firs and you like ponderosa pines, you might use that. I don't know if it's enough different to really make save a structure nearby, for instance. Is it significant? I don't know, but the wind effect is important.
Okay, and Christy
Um,
asks, can you discuss chaparral, which provides such critical biodiversity, and when all chopped down is converted to flammable non-native grasses with minimal wildlife benefits? People love oaks now, but shrublands are still vilified. And you might be talking about some of the fuels reduction that's happened around Ashland in our area that seems to remove ceanothus and other like shrub-like chaparral species. If you have any insight
yeah,
to those communities.
well, that's a very good question. And we have seen in California places where people were cutting down the chaparral just like that, and way far from their homes. There's no point cutting trees down or shrubs down if it's 100 feet away from your house, right? If you have natural vegetation 100 feet away from your house, like shrubs, chaparral, that's probably fine. If you have chaparral, 30 feet from your house, that could be an issue. So I think that overreacting and cutting down shrubs and chaparral is definitely not a good idea. It does increase non-native grasses, and particularly when you're not following it up with prescribed fire. If you just masticate a bunch of chaparral and spit out all the wood chips back onto the ground, it's what we call rearranging fuels. You're taking stuff from up here and you're putting it down here. If it's still there, and if a fire comes in soon after, it's still going to burn hot. Um, So yeah, I don't think very much of managing chaparral in that way. Now, there is an interesting conversation to be had around the fact that native people have always used fire in chaparral ecosystems. And so what is the place of very skillful, small scale prescribed burning in chaparral environments in a way that maybe doesn't open up a whole hillside to invasion from invasive grasses, but could have benefits by creating different stand structures and ages that would then potentially be beneficial to wildlife as well, and so on. So I think that's a conversation that is really happening right now in California in particular. Some native fire practitioners are pushing for people not to forget that fire has had a role in chaparral.
Great. That's a great response. Um, KJ Bailong asks, I know the ground cover burned off willow is an ideal plant for mitigating erosion concerns. What's your view on willow from a fire perspective, particularly given its tendency to grow in clumps? Do you see it as a vector for fire like blackberry, or is it more resilient or more of a resilient plant in your experience?
The ground cover, I'm not sure what is meant by ground cover. Willow, well, all deciduous plants, all deciduous trees uh, and shrubs are pretty resistant to fire. I mean, when you have leaves that are um, especially the ones with more flimsy leaves, let's say the ones which have more leathery leaves will tend to burn maybe a little bit more vigorously, but the ones with like willow that have very bendy leaves, that doesn't burn very easily. It's got a high water content, and they resprout, so that's good. They resprout after fire, so they'll come back and they'll create that shade that will then to some extent prevent blackberries from growing. So yeah, I think willow is a great thing to have. Willow does not burn very well, but neither does all of the other. Neither do any of the other riparian shrubs like dogwood or nine bark or any of those.
Thank you. I'm scrolling down to get to some more questions. I still see like 20 questions below where I'm reading.
Somebody's asking, can you suggest native tree species to serve as an ember break? Well, yeah, we can get into the nitty gritty, but again, like I said, this is a whole new idea and I don't know if it's going to work, but maybe we should try it out, especially in communities where you know which direction the wind is going to be going under these extreme fire conditions. Not all communities have that benefit, but when you have a valley like this and the wind's going to be funneled down the valley, you know where to put your ember shelter belts, theoretically. Theoretically, I would put conifers in the back, things like incense cedar, and then in front, I would put oak trees or other deciduous trees. Madrones would be fine. And then in front of that, I'd probably put some shrubs too. You'd have to think of some shrubs that don't burn super well. So we'll have to think about that for a second. And then even in the understory, you could use native wildflowers that stay green late into the season. Things like milkweed, tarweed, vinegar weed that flower late in the season because they'll stay moist late into the season and more so than grasses. So that'd be my idea. It's just an idea. So.
Great place to start. It's a good place to start. Okay. I think scrolling down a little bit, there's a Patrick. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I did see Dami said 2 years ago in Ashland, we were given a fire risk assessment for our homes. It seems to me that those assessments are now out of date. Do you know if anything is being done about these fire assessments? Yes. The city of Ashland is very active and I'm working with them and Kara Baylog is working with them to hopefully soon, very soon, implement what is called the Citizens Fire Academy, which would enable people to get training in how to do home assessments, and then they can go out and do this as a service in their neighborhood and give fire assessments to people's homes. So we're training like a cadre of volunteers to get that done. So that will be good. Stay tuned. I see somebody says the city of Ashland currently has a list of many native trees and shrubs that can't be planted within 30 feet of structures. I realize that you can't advocate against that ordinance, but is this policy something being re-examined? I don't think it's going to be re-examined. I think they like it. That's my feeling. I have mixed feelings. I have mixed feelings in that I think that there's things that are way a selection of particular species. It's like, are you planting a big mass of shrubs, or are you planting them far apart and managing them, raking the dead leaves? That'll make all the difference to me. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are more important, in my opinion, than the identity of the plant, to some degree. So, but I think that, they kind of like it. And there are some things like arborvitaes and Leland cypresses that really are a big problem, you know. Um, is Chris Dunn in the same new OSU program as you? He has studied forest plantations and fire. I wish Chris Dunn was in our program too. That would be cool. But he's doing his own thing at OSU, and we do work together sometimes, but we're not in the same program. I don't see any more questions. So
Yeah, it looks like people were leaving some comments down there. I
mhm.
think one person direct messaged me, could we have used thinning on the greenway? And in terms of like looking back on that, perhaps that's a
Thinning on the greenway. Well, the trees themselves are not the problem, right? All of those tall trees, the cottonwoods and so on, they're not the reason the fire spread in the greenway. It's really what was happening down below and where there were blackberries in particular. So I certainly think that thinning trees in the greenway would be a bad idea because it would create light for the blackberries to grow even better. And then when it comes to other plants, it's the same thing. Other native plants, native shrubs like willows, I don't think there's any benefit to thinning those, except maybe arguably to some degree if firefighters can get in, if there are regular intervals where firefighters can actually get in and maybe do some work, but then we have roads for that. So I don't think so. I think it's mostly about the blackberries.
And one more question from Michael Graham. These new fire extremes and low humidity conditions seem like a new normal. Is there a better drought index to inform the public of fire danger?
Um, I can't really answer that. I don't know what would be the best drought index to use. I think that it's a tricky question. I think that if you ask even climate scientists, it's going to be really hard to find somebody who will be willing to stick out their necks and say, oh, this is going to happen again for sure. Or is this one of those like, oh, it happens once every 300 years and we would just due to have another one of these? I wouldn't hang my hat on that. I do think that this is going to happen again. Um, and I think it's a trend, but it's hard to make it to find a real data that shows a trend because it's such an infrequent thing to begin with, to have these massive fires across half the state.
Great. Thank you so much for answering this. Oh, there's another one. Do you want to read that one, Chris?
Might the state be looking at developing something like the CCC to create jobs for people taking out blackberries and continuing work on it for 3 years? Well, I don't know about the state, but I know that at the national level, it's happening. I think I saw something about Biden's doing a civilian conservation corps again. All right. I don't know. Did anybody else see that? I think I saw something along those lines.
Cool.
I think it would be fantastic for people to be able to do work on the forest and get outside and create green jobs, thinning and burning. And we do have initiatives right now to train more people and give more people opportunities to get into things like prescribed fire, hopefully as a career for some of the up and coming youth. And I think that would be a wonderful thing for people to be able to get into that kind of line of work. And in particularly tribal communities, who've been using fire forever, and having that opportunity to be able to get out on the land and take care of the land in the way it's supposed to be done, I think would be wonderful. We'll see. We'll try to make it happen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. We really appreciated it. I was going to just jump in there if Vanessa, am I cutting you off?